Mention the battles of Blenheim, Culloden, Quebec, Waterloo, the Crimean War, the Zulu Wars, and the image of British redcoats springs to mind. And yet, in 1885, on the banks of the River Nile in northern Sudan, that image was played out for the very last time. The British Army donned their famous redcoats for one last battle, this time against the Mahdists. A battle almost no one even remembers. It put the brakes on the Mahdi and his successors' plans to spread their Islamic revolution to Egypt and marked the end of the first part of Britain's wars in the Sudan. This is the story of the Battle of Ginnis, fought in Sudan on the 30th of December, 1885. I'm a great believer that battles don't just happen out of the blue. There's always a backstory, the reason why the battle was fought in the first place. So here is the backstory to the Battle of Ginnis. With the capture of Khartoum by the Mahdi's army in January 1885 and the death of General Charles Gordon, the British efforts to relieve the city and rescue Gordon were thrown up into the air. Despite a lot of sabre rattling and a military expedition to Suakin on the Red Sea coast, the whole Nile Expedition under General Sir Garnet Wolseley was wound down, and the British were evacuated. But not entirely. Up in what is now northern Sudan, the Egyptians clung on to a tiny piece of their empire, which prior to the Mahdi's revolt had stretched all the way down to the borders of modern-day Uganda. This was not so much for prestige, although that was at play, but because the Egyptians were scared stiff that the Islamic Ansar army of the Mahdi wanted to invade Egypt. And that fear was not unfounded, as the Mahdi's puritanical Islamic message specifically demanded that the Egyptian rulers submit to his authority or perish by the sword. Just as they had when the Mahdi had started to sweep them out of Sudan, the Egyptians asked the British for assistance. The previous British Prime Minister, the anti-imperialist William Gladstone, had fallen from office that summer, not least because he was held responsible for the death of Gordon in Khartoum. The new Conservative administration under Lord Salisbury were more pro-empire. Despite the fact that they had vilified Gladstone for his hands-off approach to the whole Gordon in Khartoum affair, shrilly calling for a huge armed response. Now that they were in power, Salisbury and his Conservatives were not quite as gung-ho. They would help protect Egypt from the Mahdi's brand of Islamic revivalism, but were not interested in paying for or providing British manpower for a protracted war of reconquest in Sudan. Instead, they were happy to provide troops to defend the southern border areas to protect British interests in Egypt, in particular the Suez Canal. Along the border area, forts were established to try and prevent the Mahdi from invading Egypt. One of these was at Kosha, now called Kosha, about 100 miles south of the main military base at Wadi Halfa. Here a garrison consisting of 2 companies of the Cameroon Highlanders were supporting 2 companies of the 9th Sudanese Regiment. Just in case you weren't confused enough, there was a considerable body of Sudanese troops serving in the Egyptian army who had no intention of joining the Mahdi's cause. During the autumn of 1885, Mahdist forces, emboldened by the fall of Khartoum and the evacuation of the British, penetrated these borderlands. It seemed that Egyptian and British fears of a full-blown invasion were about to be realised. In November, the Royal West Kents, the Green Howards of the Yorkshire Regiment, and the Royal Berkshire Regiment were moved to reinforce Wadi Halfa. The Berkshires had been given their Royal prefix following their actions at the Battle of Tofrek earlier that year, which was the subject of my last video. They were joined by the 2nd Battalion of the Durham Light Infantry. 100 miles up the Nile, the Mahdist forces established a camp at Ginnis and laid siege to the Cameroon Highlanders and the Sudanese regiment in the nearby fort at Kosha. The garrison made a sortie on the 15th of December and were ambushed by the Mahdist, often called Dervish, warriors and forced to beat a hasty retreat. Less than a week later, the fort's Gardner machine gun was put out of action by Dervish artillery fire. Things were starting to look less than rosy for the garrison. The military commanders in Egypt decided that the siege needed to be lifted, and the Mahdist threat blunted. The situation in Egypt was not as straightforward as some people think. Egypt was in a strange political situation. Nominally, she was part of the declining Ottoman Empire. In reality, the Ottoman-appointed viceroys, or khedives, had been paddling their own canoes since the 1820s. It was the Khedives, for instance, who were behind the building of the Suez Canal in an effort to modernise their country. It was also that desire to put Egypt on an equal footing with the European powers that led them to build their empire by taking over most of the modern countries of Sudan and South Sudan. And it was the Khedives who, through these schemes, had bankrupted Egypt back in the 1870s. Great Britain had bought the Khedive share in the Suez Canal, which now gave her a vested interest in the country. And when her control of this vital waterway to her Asian empire had been threatened by a nationalist revolt led by Egyptian army officer Colonel Arabi Pasha, Britain had sent in her army under General Sir Garnet Wolseley. Victory over Arabi Pasha at the Battle of Tel el-Kebir now meant that the British were, to all intents and purposes, in control of a province of the Ottoman Empire. And nowhere was that control more obvious than in the military. For a start, there was a British army based in Egypt to protect British interests under their own commander. Effectively, it was an army of occupation. The regiments now heading down to Wadi Halfa were part of this setup. Then you had a specifically Egyptian army, which was being reformed after the Arabi Pasha uprising and a series of humiliating defeats down in Sudan. The commander of this Egyptian army, the Sirdar, was a British officer, Major General Francis Grenfell. The 44-year-old Grenfell came from a wealthy family which had its roots in Cornwall and used that wealth to purchase his commission back in 1859 when he was 18. He was also one of the last officers to be able to purchase a promotion to the rank of captain. His military service had seen him at the Battle of Ulundi, the final battle of the Zulu War in 1879, and the Battle of Tel el-Kebir, where Wolseley had defeated Arabi Pasha. In April 1885, he had succeeded General Sir Evelyn Wood as Sirdar of the Egyptian army. And it was to Grenfell, as commander of the Egyptian army, that the Khedive looked to remove that dervish threat from the fort at Kosha. In this endeavour, he would command a joint British-Egyptian army of approximately 3,500 men. Grenfell formed his army into 3 brigades. The 1st Brigade, under Major General Butler, consisted of the 1st Royal Berkshires, the 1st Royal West Kents, the 2nd Durham Light Infantry, and an Egyptian artillery detachment, escorted by 60 of their own troops. The 2nd Brigade was a much more international contingent. The 2nd Brigade was a much more international contingent. The British contributed the 1st Battalion of the Yorkshires, the Green Howards, and a unit from the Royal Artillery. This unit, under Lieutenant Colonel Whately, were armed with 2.5-inch mountain guns. These are also known as screw guns, as they could be broken into parts and carried on several mules before being screwed together for action, which made them versatile artillery pieces in rough terrain. There would also be both British and Egyptian members of their respective camel corps, and nearly 300 men from the 1st Egyptian Regiment. They would be joined by the garrison at Kosha Fort, the Cameron Highlanders and the 9th Sudanese. Whilst the 150 men of the Sudanese regiment were part of the Egyptian army, they were at this time considered very distinct. Not only because they physically came from Sudan, but because they were generally seen as accomplished soldiers, whereas the troops from Egypt proper were a cause for concern. Not only were these particular men not tested in battle, but the track record of Egyptian troops fighting the Mahdists was not impressive. A huge Egyptian army, numbering nearly 10,000, had been effectively wiped out by the Mahdi's forces just a few years earlier, and another Egyptian force had been routed at the First Battle of El Teb. Trying to reinvigorate the Egyptian army was the main challenge for the Sirdars, Generals Evelyn Wood and now Grenfell, and to date the success had been limited, to say the least. The Battle of Ginnis would be the first test for the new Egyptian army, apart from their Sudanese battalions, since the fall of Khartoum at the beginning of the year. Completing Grenfell's army was the Cavalry Brigade under Colonel Blake. Blake's command consisted of 1 troop of the British 20th Hussars, the Egyptian Camel Corps, a contingent of British Mounted Infantry, and a 50-strong contingent of Egyptian cavalry. The Cavalry Brigade had arrived in the Kosha area on the 22nd of December and had several skirmishes with the Mahdist forces while they awaited the arrival of the 2 infantry brigades. Grenfell, at the head of those brigades, arrived on the 29th of December, effectively lifting the siege of the fort. The following morning, the 30th of December 1885, he marched out to meet the Mahdists. The Anglo-Sudan campaign of 1884-85 had seen more and more British regiments finally moving over from their traditional redcoats to khaki. Despite red tunics standing out like a sore thumb in most of the theatres where Queen Victoria's soldiers fought, there was still something powerfully symbolic about the traditional redcoat. I guess there still is. It was a hard image to shake off. Victorian artists insisted on depicting British soldiers in red even when they were actually wearing khaki in the Boer War 14 years later. Those of you who watched my video about the failed Nile Expedition to rescue Gordon might recall that General Wolseley had ordered the small party from the Royal Sussex Regiment on the boats heading to Khartoum to wear their scarlet tunics in an attempt to impress both the defenders and the attackers. Grenfell decided that a similar tactic was needed at Ginnis to both impress and intimidate the Mahdists. He ordered his British units to swap their khaki and grey serge uniforms for their traditional redcoats, which they duly did, all except the Durham Light Infantry, who'd left theirs in Cairo. Whilst there are reports that some British soldiers wore red during a rebellion in Zululand a couple of years later, and that the Connaught Rangers did likewise at the Battle of Dongola in Kitchener's Sudan campaign, it is generally accepted that this was the last major battle in which the British Army were to go into action in their traditional red tunics. At just after 6 a.m, Grenfell's artillery opened fire on the Mahdist positions, the attack seemingly catching them by surprise. Grenfell adopted a two-pronged attack. The 2nd Brigade would storm the village of Kosha, whilst the 1st Brigade would move past them to pin down the Mahdist camp at Ginnis, 1 mile upriver. The cavalry would provide a screen to the east to prevent any dervish flanking actions from the desert. The attack on Kosha was carried out by the garrison from the formerly besieged fort, the Cameron Highlanders and the 9th Sudanese. They attacked straight along the banks of the Nile into the town. The rest of the 2nd Brigade provided covering fire from the raised ground to the east. And meanwhile, a Nile steamboat called the Lotus, commanded by Lieutenant Alexander Perkins from the Royal Navy, provided additional covering fire with a mounted Gardner gun. Having fought their way through the houses of Kosha, the Camerons and the Sudanese were now joined by the rest of the 2nd Brigade in the palm groves just beyond the town. By now, the Mahdist army, numbering 6,000, were fired up and ready for a fight, streaming out of their camp at Ginnis to take on Grenfell's 3,500 men. In the palm groves between Ginnis and Kosha, they ran into the Yorkshire Regiment. The men of the Green Howards had missed the Nile Expedition, having been placed on garrison duties in Egypt. Now was their moment to show what they were made of, and they didn't disappoint. Frustrated at their lack of progress, the Mahdists now swung towards the 1st Brigade up on the high ground, where they managed to use the terrain to launch a surprise attack on the Camel Corps. But before they could exploit the element of surprise, the Durham Light Infantry had moved forward and opened well-controlled volley fire into the Mahdist advance. Unlike previous battles between the British and Dervish armies at places such as Abu Klea, Grenfell eschewed a defensive square and instead formed his men into an 800-foot extended line. The withering firepower from an 800-foot front was something that most of the Mahdist troops had never experienced before, and they started to fall back beyond their camp to Atab. But before they could make this into a defendable position, Grenfell sent the cavalry forward, and the mounted infantry cleared the defenders with a bayonet charge. It was now 10 a.m, and the Dervish army were fleeing south into the desert and along the banks of the Nile. As the victorious British-Egyptian army made their way back through Kosha, they were fired upon by some Dervish riflemen holed up in a house. They were pinned down until Lieutenant Colonel Wetsley brought one of his screw guns forward to end the resistance. The Battle of Ginnis had lasted 4 hours and had cost the Mahdists 400 dead and many more wounded. Grenfell's Anglo-Egyptian army had lost 10 men dead and about 40 wounded. Somewhat ironically, considering these light losses, the Yorkshire Regiment, who had lost 1 man injured at Ginnis, were to lose 84 of their battalion to typhoid and sunstroke when they got back to Wadi Halfa afterwards. And likewise, the Durham Light Infantry were to lose 50 men in Wadi Halfa too. The Battle of Ginnis, 30th of December 1885, is pretty much lost to the sands of history. It wasn't a close-run battle like Abu Klea. The losses were not on the sort of jaw-dropping scale of Omdurman in 1898, and no Victoria Crosses were won. And it went according to plan, which a lot of battles failed to do. It was the last time that British troops fought a battle in their traditional red tunics. Now, it does seem that the 6th Dragoons and the Royal Scots wore them during the Zulu Rebellion of 1888, but there were no set-piece battles there, just a few light skirmishes. And whilst there are claims that the Connaught Rangers might have worn redcoats in 1896, I've struggled to find conclusive proof to corroborate that. And even if it's true, they would have been the only unit wearing red. At Ginnis, the majority of the British, apart from the Durham Light Infantry, wore their red coats. It was the first time that the new Egyptian army had successfully faced the Mahdists. It was also the first time that the British and Egyptian armies had fought side by side. They'd do so again in the future, not least at the battles of Atbara and Omdurman in Kitchener's Sudan campaign. Above all, the victory at Ginnis had, for the time being, halted the Mahdist steamroller, and Egypt was safe. Which was good news for the Khedive, whom the Mahdists wished to depose, and the British and their interest in the Suez Canal. Taken in the round, Francis Grenfell had won a battle pretty much according to his plans with an international army, including untried Egyptians, and taken the lightest of casualties. He hadn't done a bad job. And his impressive turnaround of the Egyptian army would continue at the Battle of Toski in 1889, when he would smash a Sudanese Mahdist invasion of Egypt. But that is in the future. As he surveyed the battlefield at Ginnis, Grenfell could see in the distance the Mahdists streaming away across the desert. What he was unaware of was that a boat full of dervish banners, arms and important refugees was desperately following them up the Nile, seeking safety. But the British were in hot pursuit. 2 days later, a small party of Durham Light Infantry would catch up with that boat. And what happened then would be the beginning of another fascinating history story, one which I'll tell you about in my next video. The golden thread of history that connects us to our past and to each other keeps on weaving. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed that story. Check out my other videos about British and British military history. And don't forget to keep your eyes open for my next video about the Durham Light Infantry and that boat. But until then, thanks for your support, keep well, and I'll see you very soon.